Okay, a big welcome to everybody who's joining this afternoon's webinar. This webinar is part of a series of 8 that are happening this week as part of the Urban Living Lite series. Those beautiful people that have joined us today and are participating will be shown on the slide in a moment. We've had these webinars since March last year, and over 7,500 people have registered, which I think is a great show of the collectivism in hospitality and real estate today. So next slide, please, Justin.
We've all witnessed the speed of change at which the world is evolving, and the Urban Living Festival is now so more relevant than ever as we look to define the future of hospitality and real estate.
Urban Living Festival came about really based around a lot of different hospitality and real estate asset classes all converging really at the same time. You've got co-work, co-live, PRS, built to rent, student housing. So the big idea really was ultimately quite simple, to bring everybody together. So I'm really looking forward to attracting, I'd say, real estate and hospitality urban innovators to explore what I suppose urban living actually is.
It's a thought leadership forum as much as it is a forum for business. I know I'm going to learn a lot, and I'm going to learn a lot about everybody that plays in it, providers, suppliers, tech, accounting services, all of the pieces that you need to make your business successful. I'll learn a lot there.
However far technology moves along, people will always have the need to come together, to socialise, to work and collaborate together, to be hospitable and basically to be social animals.
Okay, so date for the diary is the 7th to the 8th of July. Just before we get on to this webinar, Investment Strategies of the Future, we've just got a short video of our series sponsor, Yardi. Okay, just some housekeeping for the session. Everybody is muted except for our contributors today. There is a recording that will be sent to everybody via email just to follow up on tomorrow. If you do have a question, we welcome lots and lots of questions through the conversation. Please use the Q&A box, which is at the base of your screen. And also, there'll be a 15-minute additional time at the end of the webinar for people to chat or connect with other attendees. We'll leave that open. Okay, next slide, please. There we are. Okay, this is just a bit about myself. I really enjoy putting people together to hopefully do business, and I think that's what the Urban Living Festival will be about. Okay, the content and context for today. This is what the discussion is going to be about. As the UK transitions outside of the EU and the crisis passes, how are real estate investors adapting to the accelerated trends and structural changes affecting asset classes? How is this affecting liquidity and pricing, and will we see more opportunities on the horizon? What will the risk reward spectrum look like? Will investors drive forward capital allocations and adjust risk strategies? Okay, here's a bit of context that we've published on our websites recently, just to give people an idea of how active the marketplace has been in a variety of asset classes. There's been a transaction in the hotel space with Boundary House, an office block looking to be repurposed in the City of London into a hotel. You've got DTZ doing a lot of forward funded deals as part of the collective. And probably the latest is Scape and APG teaming up for a purpose-built student accommodation joint venture. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today's discussion. Nick Barker from Gravis. If you could just provide a brief overview of yourself and your job role, please.
Thanks, Piers. Can you hear me okay? Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. So I'm Nick Barker. I work at Gravis. I'm a director there and part of the executive committee. Gravis is a boutique fund manager with 6 funds managing about £3.5 billion of client money. And I'm the lead manager to the GCP student vehicle, which is the UK's only REIT that focuses on student assets, primarily in and around London.
Thanks, Nick. Freddie?
Hi, Piers. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Afternoon all. My name's Freddie Wanacott. I work at M&G Real Estate, who are a global fund manager, and I'm responsible for investment across the living subsectors. M&G has around 35 billion under management, and my geographical focus is UK and Europe.
Thanks, Freddie. Jonathan?
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Managing Director at Package Living. We were formed about 3 years ago with backing from Fiera Real Estate, which is a Canadian headquartered global asset manager with about 125 billion under management. We're a specialist pure play build to rent developer operator. We have 3 strategies. We develop multifamily, so city centre apartments for rent. We develop single family rental, so suburban housing in the suburbs, also for rent. And then we have a development management business advising clients, but within the build to rent sector. So a lot of local authorities and retail REITs on how to position non-performing or underperforming retail.
Okay. Thank you, Jonathan. Patrick?
Afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Smith. I'm Investment Director at Frogmore. Frogmore are UK based, essentially we're a property company currently running private equity funds. We're on our 4th incarnation, and we are UK specialists really looking towards value add repositioning opportunities anywhere within the UK. So completely sector agnostic, just looking for to generate, high risk adjusted returns across the UK.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So obviously we've hopefully managed to sail through the storm of what we've faced with COVID. But Nick, to kick off, from a student housing perspective, how did you, manage the crisis, and what challenges did you face back then, and perhaps as things open up, which we're really hopeful they will do over the next few months, what challenges do you think you'll face over the next 6?
Piers, thanks for this. And I guess we're coming up to a year from when I caught COVID. I think it was the 3rd of March that I developed my fever and was poorly and working from home. And it's been quite an experience and quite a bit of a roller coaster, really, in that prior to this week, a year ago, GCP Student was experiencing perhaps its best moment in time, where its share price was at an all-time high. There was a lot of conviction and confidence about the future, and in particular, student numbers back then for the academic year that was going to start in September 20 was looking really, really positive. So that all changed in a very short period of time, and in particular, I guess the initial response from me and the rest of the team was all about well-being and ensuring that our customers and our stakeholders were all, being kept as safe as we could at the time. But what we did see in the weeks, through March, April, and May was a mass exodus, I guess. A lot of students jumping on flights and heading home. We saw it across domestic students, but we also saw a lot of international students fly home. So our portfolio occupancy last academic year dropped to about 30%. And whilst all of this was happening, we were in quite a fortunate position as a business because we had just raised £78 million right at the end of 2019. So we went into this storm with a very sort of healthy balance sheet and with a couple of pipeline assets that we were pursuing and looking to add to the portfolio. But one of the decisions that we made throughout this whole lockdown period was that actually we wanted to keep that sort of prudent level of liquidity in the company. So we dropped 2 assets that we had in our pipeline and we didn't acquire them. So the first one, the decision was made in April 2020 not to buy a central London student housing scheme. And then towards the end of the year in September, we decided not to buy a building in Guildford. And the reason why we did that was at the time we felt that there was still significant uncertainty. One of the things that's changed, and I liked how you started the conversation there, Pierre, saying that we're emerging from COVID and hopefully a lot of the sort of the negativity and the issues we faced is now in the past. We are feeling very positive about the future, and that's because we've seen now a lot of the sort of leading indicators for next year coming through with some seismic changes in terms of the number of students applying, domestic students and non-EU international students. So there's a lot of reasons for us to feel good about the future. But yeah, it was all about well-being and then sort of tailoring our investment decisions to the circumstances at the time and ultimately sort of looking to preserve liquidity. That's how we chose to react to the issues that we were facing through the pandemic.
Okay, thanks, Nick. Would anyone else like to come in there? So, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll paint a slightly different experience, and I think it's because we're a developer who is still very much in the development phase of our business plan. So we probably we've benefited from the fact that we're not yet operational on any of our assets. So we haven't had to deal with some of the operational challenges that Nick just mentioned, whether that's PBSA or build to rent, being operationally geared and dealing with residents and kind of, the pandemic has obviously had its challenges, not least in hospitality as well. Whereas we're a bit more like a submarine at the moment. We're just kind of quietly able to continue to buy sites, design, specify, plan, procure schemes in a way where our business is sort of largely uninterrupted, principally because we've been able to do it from home mostly as effectively as we have been able to do it from the workplace, albeit collaboration is more difficult. And our view is we've been very risk on. We've acquired a number of sites in the last 12 months because capital for our particular asset class it's still very present, perhaps more so than it was pre-pandemic, and that'll kind of to use the submarine analogy allow us to emerge when I think the dust has settled into a world of, we hope, a recovering economy, and kind of rental growth again. So we're sort of fortunate in a stage of our business plan and our evolution, and it's allowed us to actually kind of broaden our strategy to include things like, whereas previously going in we were exclusively focused on multifamily, so flat city centre apartments for rent. We've now broadened that to single family rentals, so suburban housing for rent, because we think there's there were kind of structural and fundamental reasons why that was a good thing to do, but we think that's just been expedited by the kind of the propensity for, you know, that flight from the city to the suburbs, and the consumer desire for just more living space, and the working from home movement, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of all kind of helpful for that particular model. And also we've now started redeveloping some non-performing retail assets as well. So it's created a kind of an explosion of opportunity for us in a way that has kind of downside protection, principally because we're just not operational. So we're not at the coalface of that part of the kind of the pandemic, as it were.
Okay. And the sites that you've acquired, were they stalled projects, or you know, based around ground up development?
They're new build, unconsented land, ground up development. If I understand your question correctly, they're not distressed acquisitions. We've not seen any widening of yields in the residential sector, whether that's residential for sale or residential for rent. Yields have remained broadly stable. So our business plan is just kind of carried on as were. We're not seeing any opportunistic deals, but we're not seeing, you know, widening of yields. We're not seeing things get more expensive. It's broadly speaking, after the kind of the initial lull in Q1, Q2 of last year, it's broadly speaking business as usual in the residential sector. I think principally because, you know, logistics and residential have done well when at the expense of more, dare I say, traditional asset classes, whether that's office, retail, and so you're just seeing, you know, capital continue attracted to those returns, those risk profiles, and those sectors.
Yeah, sure. Patrick, can I bring you in here, because we were talking about deals earlier, and you know, the slide that we showed were very, you know, PBSA heavy. You know, we're not seeing a lot in the hotel space at the moment. What are you seeing from a Frogmore perspective?
I think again, I think what we've seen as we've gone through this whole transition is the acceleration of certain trends. So, you know, and if you look at it wider than just, I know, just the living sectors. I mean, Jonathan's absolutely right. There's been a huge flood of capital into the resi markets across all the different sectors. So, you know, it's beds and sheds are the kind of watchwords, although meds is now the new one that's sort of creeping up in terms of everyone looking at healthcare. But so the traditional markets have been struggling. You know, anything with retail has just been accelerated. So lots of tenants defaults, CVAs, everything else has just been exasperating the position. And those trends were already set in play way before COVID. So you've had an acceleration there. The hospitality one is probably the biggest one that's hit just purely as a result of COVID, where obviously they've had real restrictions and differences in terms of how they can actually perform and where their rental lines are coming from. So that's been really hard hit. But I think, as Jonathan said, you know, there has been much less distress in the markets than I think we would have all anticipated. And I think that's probably a result of you know, the environment we're in with very low interest rates. The banks have all been very well behaved this way through. So again, they've been working with borrowers. And let's hope, you know, with the vaccines and the program that the UK are on, that you know, I think that there is a lot of anticipation that you know, we're now seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and everyone seems to be working in a collaborative way to actually make sure that is the case. So I'd agree with what Jonathan said. You know, there's been very little distress in the markets, even though overall transactional levels have been quite low. You know, I think when we were all sitting there in Q2 with the lowest transactions since the GFC, everyone kind of feared a little bit that it would be a continuation, but Q3 and 4 actually saw a pickup. So the overall year finished at something around 42 odd billion, which was only about 23% down on 2019. So, you know, considering the pain that everybody was in and the distress that was being caused in the markets, actually, it's not a bad performance for the UK. And I think a lot of that momentum is still pent up in the system. You know, I think everyone's got to remember this isn't the GFC was a capital liquidity issue. This situation is very different, and it's going to be fascinating to watch as we emerge out and how capital deploys.
Yeah. Freddie, can I bring you in here? What's M&G's take? Is it similar to Patrick's, or anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think just tracking back to that piece around challenges with regard to COVID, maybe useful for me to comment, given we've got a reasonable size fund in the residential build to rent space on kind of live operational assets. So we've committed about $1 billion into into build to rent, of which that equates to about 3,500 units, and 2,000 or so are live, with the remaining 1,500 under construction. And in terms of the development activity, it was initially, there were some delays associated with our contractor partners grappling with how they dealt with social distancing and other factors on site, more pertinent for the sites that were at latter stages of construction, where earlier, when they're working outside, it was easier to operate. But then since that initial delays, we've seen that contractors have been able to continue working and haven't to the date now seen much more in terms of construction delays. The more challenging activity for us has been particularly around buildings PCing. So for us, we received a building, for example, in Ilford of 206 units at the end of March, which is just about the worst time you could have possibly had receive a build to rent asset. So unable to do any leasing activity, challenges with things like council tax on empty buildings, and then having to lease up on the outback of a pandemic. But indeed, things have picked up again now, and we're reaching 70% occupancy in the building, and it's good to see that the occupational market has started to recover. In terms of the stabilized portfolio, it's been really interesting to see the position with regard to occupancy, that since the fund's been launched in 2013, the portfolio has consistently achieved around 95 to 97% occupancy, with arrears of 0.5 to 1.5%. And from an income perspective, this dropped to the lowest point we've ever seen in the high 80s on our stabilized portfolio in July. And this is primarily driven by the fact that we had limited ability to lease, and we also lost what we now call as transitory residents. So either students that were living in our residential building, or individuals who didn't call the flat they were renting from us home. They were traveling either back to family or internationally. And what's been really interesting, though, is that from that reduction in occupancy, we've been able to prove the point around the resilience of the sector in terms of diversification of income and defensive, because pricing is so sensitive with regard to demand. So the second that we dropped the pricing and adjusted in certain markets, we're able to recover that income back up to the mid-90s. So it's been a real testament to the resilience of the sector, and especially, it's been a gargantuan effort in order to achieve this position, but we do count ourselves fortunate, as Jonathan and Patrick have alluded to, compared to some of our commercial colleagues, particularly in the retail sector, we've been having a much tougher time. Indeed, operationally as well, we had similar experiences to Nick on from a PBSA point of view, that health and safety and well-being were the first order of the day. But then after we ensured that our buildings became COVID safe and a safe environments to be in, it's been a great opportunity as well to launch a number of sustainability initiatives, for example. Things like right at the start of lockdown, we put clothing recycle banks across all of our portfolio. And over the course of 2020, have so far collected 17 tons of clothing that equates to the weight of 2 London buses, or indeed roughly 66,000 worth of potential revenue for the charities that we've collected it on behalf of. So that, and also in combination of our ability to then go online, creating a digital platform to engage with residents in that regard, has been a real benefit to us in taking some positives from an incredibly challenging time. So we launched this digital platform and been doing things from, indeed, whether it's learning how to cook the best sourdough or tips for dating online during a pandemic, anything along those lines have been great to be able to engage with residents in ways you wouldn't have otherwise done. So there have been some upshots to it, but echoing Nick and others' comments, it's been an incredibly challenging time and a huge amount of work from teams to remain where we want to be in terms of occupancy.
Okay, and great to hear on the sustainability side of things, Freddie. We have got a session, a webinar on Thursday, which I think focuses on the ESG and the sustainability aspects of hospitality and real estate. So, of course, you know, maybe with the influence of COVID and perhaps how things have changed, where do you guys maybe see the opportunities that will manifest themselves as a, you know, I suppose ultimately as a result of the guest, you know, resident prioritizing maybe sustainability? Freddie is an example of that. Where do you see the opportunities from a real estate asset class perspective? You know, for instance, are hotels going to really bounce back when, you know, lockdown you know comes to an end? Are we going to go back to so-called normal, or are there going to be aspects of sustainability plus other things that are going to make other investments attractive?
Yes, shall I have a quick stab? So from a GCP student perspective, we believe, as I think you pointed out, that some of the lines are starting to blur. And, you know, in our portfolio, we've got one asset that has a relaxed planning consent, which means that anyone can live in that building. It's not limited just to students. And that happens to be the one building in our portfolio that doesn't appear to have experienced a pandemic. So students are still, and other residents are still in occupation, and the rent is flowing undisturbed effectively. So I think maybe one of the things that COVID is teaching us is perhaps from our perspective as a business that focuses on the student, that perhaps in the medium to long term, there might be some benefits, or it warrants exploring whether we should be trying to sort of relax the consents on our portfolio as a whole. And one of the things that's changed, I guess, not as a result of the pandemic, but because of government policy, is that students who are coming to the UK for their higher education, they are now entitled to apply for something called a graduate visa, which means that once they finish their studies, they're entitled to stay and get some work experience for 2 years post qualification. And I'm imagining that those students would probably still want to live in a similar building to what they experienced whilst an undergraduate at a UK university. So they probably still want to live in a well-located building with a cinema, with a gym, with, you know, like-minded people who are sort of going through a similar experience. So I feel like there will be some interesting and attractive opportunities to be contemplated there. And then in terms of the impact of COVID itself, one of the things I've noticed from where I sit, where, you know, effectively I'm looking to build a pipeline because we are going to be back on the front foot, looking to add to our portfolio some assets. And maybe going back to something Jonathan said, Jonathan's not alone in terms of being someone who doesn't have exposure to operational assets, but someone who's looking to build a portfolio and hopefully the assets becoming operational once the dust had settled. And in that space, I've noticed that there's quite a few private high net worths, individuals who bought land with a view to, changing the planning, getting a large scheme on it, maybe offices with residential above, or possibly a hotel or a service department. And those individuals are turning to us, the student housing world, and sort of saying, well, we'd quite like to sort of potentially lock in with you guys a deal. So I'm seeing more opportunities in London for student housing schemes or schemes with relaxed consents, but for the academic year starting in September 23 or 24. It may be short-lived, because if we do experience a bounce back, these owners may actually choose to pivot back to their original game plan. But in the meantime, I'm trying to see if I can lock in some of these opportunities, because there is a real structural undersupply of accommodation for students in London.
Very good. Freddie, would you like to, did you echo what Nick's saying there?
Yeah, very much so. We're like you, Nick, getting lots of conversations, especially from developers, owners of land that have had hotel consents that are then looking for change of use to build to rent or PBSA, particularly so in London. As we as an investor, for instance, in the student market, are really looking through the current short-term income challenges to those medium-term fundamentals, either through taking it as development exposure through forward fundings for schemes that are finishing with leaking seeding cycles for PC in 23, 24, 24, 25, or having protections with net operating income guarantees. But looking more widely, we kind of classify investment into the living sector focused on matching the different stages in the consumer life cycle journey. So by that, I mean, I've split it really down into 5 different sectors. You've got learn, connect, grow, and then relax and reconnect. So learn is the aspect associated with student accommodation, investment into PBSA, proximity to universities and community important factors. And that's an area we're continuing to be actively investing in. Connect is that area or the specific segment that's targeted at 25 to 35-year-old young professional cohort, more focused on where networking is a key aspect of their life from both a social and business network point of view. This has been the main key focus for our build to rent fund, specializing or investing mostly in urban flatted developments, predominantly in London and the Southeast. Indeed, that could be an interesting area for us for 2021 to invest into the London market, as rents have been challenged there recently, and so could be a good point in time to capitalize on that fact, albeit potentially the recent budget announcements may not help pricing and house price inflation for us to be able to access that part of the market. The next life cycle stage is that what we call grow. So this is really driven by a focus on family and consequently the increasing importance of space and proximity to schools. So we've already got some exposure to this as a fund through our suburban investment with Crest Nicholson near Crawley and Reading, which indeed I believe, Jonathan, you might have had an involvement in a past life. So that's mostly flatted development, but within a suburban context. And I see this as a really key area of focus for us for investment this year. As has been alluded to, there's been a shift of individuals that were in that connect phase that are then moving to the grow phase. So looking for more green space, suburbanization, and proximity to good quality schooling. So that's a particularly active area of investment for us, especially with a sustainability hat on to ensure that the schemes we're delivering are sustainable, both from an environmental point of view, but social as well. And then just the final piece to cover off as a potentially really interesting subsector is looking more at the what we call relaxed stage of life cycle, so the retirement point. So this really is for individuals that are retiring, but before they need any additional care. And we see this as a hugely undercatered segment of the market, especially from a rental perspective. So we're certainly looking actively now to invest in that space. And indeed, it may be in a combination from a rental point of view, or some for sales exposure, or indeed potentially some kind of intermediate tenure affordable housing. And I suppose that's just a final area that could be particularly attractive for us this year, that affordable housing space. So we are in the latter stages of setting up a investment strategy to invest into the shared ownership market. This is where investors can benefit from the security of the income and the index-linked nature of that income with shared ownership occupiers, while still benefiting from house price growth. So watch this space, because it's certainly a really interesting sector for us that has huge potential for growth in the market.
Okay, thank you, Freddie.
I think that's really interesting. It's kind of the whole of that build to rent resi piece is now expanding right the way across the whole as it evolves. And so you know, right the way from student through to retirement or, you know, end of life. You know, there is so much capital looking to deploy into the sector. It's interesting that, you know, and it's already starting to have to evolve in terms of finding these different formats that it can go in. So it's, I think that'll be good for the market overall. We'll certainly give a lot of variety and a lot of different options.
Indeed.
Sorry, Jonathan, I came in just before you wanted to say something.
Yeah, indeed, Patrick. There's lots of similarities, but also differences in the dynamics of those markets that is useful to be splitting them down so that you can ensure you properly cater for consumers' needs.
Yeah, well, the rental market, particularly in retirement, is only just really getting going. It's been quite strong in the States and Australia and in other these markets which are more developed than ours. And I guess it comes down to that kind of demographic in terms of whether they're really ready to rent for their final home move, if you like, or whether they still want to own their own house. And so again, it's evolving, but there's only one or two schemes in the UK as I understand it.
Exactly, it's at very nascent stages, and there's also that piece around potentially having retirement living shared ownership. That could be a halfway house where occupiers can still feel like they own their own man and his castle, etc., but then have been able to benefit from releasing capital to either facilitating retirement or pass on to the next generation without having to move to a pure rental model. So even within the retirement space, there's lots of sub-segments that could work for different consumers.
Yeah.
Our sort of underlying thesis, if you will, is that an increasing cohort of the population or demographics now are unable to buy, ergo they rent. And so if you arc that kind of residential journey from institutionally owned PBS residents who are kind of emigrating that into institutionally owned build to rent, and then potentially into institutionally owned senior living for rent, there's a kind of a whole kind of, you know, living tenure or strategy that sits across all of that, notwithstanding the fact that, you know, these residents are never accruing enough equity in which to buy. And I think that's a kind of a different societal challenge that we haven't picked up on, and it's certainly not going to solve on this call. But I do think if you accept that, then it's incumbent on developers, investors, operators like us to provide accommodation as people kind of move through that journey. I mean, picking up on themes now as to, you know, what's next. I mean, our big thematic bet now is in the suburban rental sector. So kind of moving away from multifamily, which we'll you know, kind of remain active in, but developing single family homes in suburbs or fringe urban locations for that, you know, 35 to 45 plus demographic, some of whom work, you know, formerly or are millennials who are kind of moving out of city centres. You know, that demographic is probably north of 30% of the private rented sector now. It's up 17% in a little over a decade. And you know,
but there has been no product historically, has there? That's what's been holding it back. There is that, you know, there wasn't the product.
No product
in the UK.
Service, and it's not fit for purpose. You know, a lot of them have children. Probably more than you know, nearly 60% have children. And this is a demographic who, speaking as someone who has children, it's hard to save. It's hard to raise deposits when you've got 2, 3 kids. It's hard to get mortgages because of that. You're impeded. So if you weren't an owner before, you're unlikely to be one now as you kind of move through the gears of the demographics, as you're encumbered with kind of, children. And this is a generation who, these are the refugees from the GFC, right? So the people who were disproportionately affected by the dislocation that happened in kind of 08, 09 and beyond. People who were unable to buy and raise deposits and had lost their jobs then are adversely affected now. So there's an increasing wall of people for whom need houses, not flats, because that's not appropriate any longer, but who still can't buy. And this generation rent or rent as a necessity, our kind of thematic bet is that there's both a consumer and an investor demand for that product. So we're pretty long in that sector now, and I think you're going to see a lot of growth and ultimately yield compression in that sector, just as we've seen in multifamily over the last decade.
Patrick, where do you think the value is, at the moment from a Frogmore perspective? Are you looking maybe a bit further out of city centres, maybe less attractive to what it was pre-COVID? What sectors would?
Yeah, I think. Well, we're keeping an eye on all the markets at the moment, but ultimately where there is the most distress is ultimately where there will be some big opportunities. So, and that is almost certainly going to be around retail. And I think what we're seeing in terms of trends is that some of these big old shopping centres and city centres that are now, really suffering, and with those trends having accelerated through COVID. So it's going to be about how they get repositioned. Now, I'm not saying, for someone like us, it gets quite tricky, but we are seeing it as a theme, and we're seeing increasingly local authorities being really the kind of key stakeholder in terms of how you actually reposition these centres, because ultimately, land values have to come down to a level that enable them to be repositioned, and then it will be about how the uses then come through, and we're already seeing it in terms of whether that's residential, healthcare, but it's kind of breathing new life back into the actual heart of the towns and the cities. So that is quite interesting, and it's about repurposing, either obsolete or very challenged real estate into uses that are appropriate. And I think all of that build to rent sector, however that comes through, that will be one of the primary movers. The hard part ultimately is the planning system. So ultimately getting local authorities to move with developers that are willing to take those risks. But when you start grappling with all of the taxation that then comes into play, whether it's through provision of affordable housing, SIL contributions, all those kind of things, it does become very difficult then to produce. But that is definitely a theme, and you're going to be following distress. You mentioned particularly earlier hotels, and again, a lot of if you call it distress around hotels at the moment, is the answer to your question is nobody knows how quickly. If you remember back to 9/11, no one was going to be flying in planes, straight afterwards, and it did take a little while before everyone was quite happy, to get back on it. And it is going to come down to the vaccinations and confidence. And it will be interesting to see how much, we've all got so used to doing Zoom calls and everything else, how much business travel now, particularly in the new world where we're all trying to be a lot greener and our carbon footprints and everything. But, how willing will everyone be to jump on planes for business and go travel? I mean, I think it will still happen, but I think it's going to happen at lower volumes, and it's going to take a while for it to kind of increase back. So the hotels, certainly that we've been involved with, there has been some funding distress in terms of how they get over this kind of short-term gap in the market where their income levels have obviously completely been devastated. But I think ultimately the actual occupiers and the people in that market are all saying it's kind of a two-year recovery, and it will pick up because ultimately it's inbuilt in our system. And I think if you move on to the next bit where again, the commuting is going to be affected by this as well. So people may want to stay over in terms of the work. They'll live more rurally, come into London, maybe stay 1 or 2 nights, and then go back and continue their work on remote formats. So again, that will boost hotels. So I think ultimately this is about getting over the short-term thing. I think there is a lot of confidence that it will happen. The interesting bit, I think, will be whether hotels start to offer a wider scope of business. So whether they start to look at, providing desks as well as beds. So that will be quite interesting, and all the facilities that go around that. I know a couple of them already interested in looking at that. But it'll come back to what Nick's saying. A lot of these outfits will start to broaden out their offer. So it'll become a lot more varied, and we'll see, all mixing around, co-living, mixing with students. That's already happening. There was even a concept of mixing students with older people. So again, all of this seems to be mushing together now, and it will be fascinating to watch over the next 2 to 3 years, where it all goes. But the challenges are there. But I think there is definitely a willingness to get on. Certainly, government is going to push it. That we've been promised sort of relaxation in the planning regulations. We've already had it through the use classes in offices, which will make transitioning buildings through to other uses that are more relevant today easier. And it's going to be really interesting to see what they do in the budget, where it doesn't sound like anything's coming through quickly about business rates. But there are lots of these issues that we really do need to tackle to enable buildings to be repositioned and provided for the future.
Thanks, Patrick. We've had a question come in from Prab Jaswal. How might alternative residential classes leverage schemes such as Birch Grove's Try Before You Buy, which I think is in the retirement living space, to lure first-time homeowners? That is quite an interesting one. Anybody like to take that?
Well, on the government, they're talking about shifting this Help to Buy scheme in terms of providing government guarantees across mortgages, which again, when we were all looking to buy, 100% mortgages were available. Might not have been what you wanted, but you could get them. Whereas now it's all completely changed. So it will be quite interesting whether there'll be positive government moves to try and encourage the young back into actually being able to secure mortgages, so that they don't have to become generation rent, which is the term Boris used. So maybe there will be some direct government intervention to help that happen.
Another one from Paul Rands, and anybody to take this. Do you envisage an institutional investor acquiring a large-scale housing development, so 1,000+ houses, not flats, from a house builder purely for rental, or is that still very much a build to sell product? Okay, Jonathan, go. Yeah,
I'll take this one. So I think it's unlikely at this stage of the evolution of the single family rental sector, which is what Paul is talking about. It tends to work where for an investor like us to acquire or forward fund an element of a master plan community that is being delivered by a house builder, it works well in that partnership arrangement where the home builder is doing a slice or a percentage for market sale, because ultimately they're driven by margin and house price inflation, and that's their core business. And there's another element of Section 106 or affordable housing that they're looking to solve for, and then they're selling PRS to somebody like us. It's kind of that tenure arrangement. So it does work on large schemes, and 1,000 is certainly very large. But the institution, I think, would be unwilling, and Freddie might correct me with this because he might have a different view, but that's a lot of homes. That's a big check to write. It's a lot of allocation to a single, dare I say, untested market where absorption may be more challenging than, say, similar numbers. And frankly, that would be large for a multifamily scheme in a city centre location. So I don't think the appetite is there for that quantum yet. Speaking personally, our model is sort of 50 to 150 homes per suburban location, nothing like those numbers. And I think to do more, you start to eat into the home builders' ability to solve for the 106 and also to continue with market sale. So I don't think that we're quite there yet. I think it's on the lower end of that spectrum than the higher end.
Yeah, I'd echo your comments, Jonathan. That's probably too much concentration risk. More from a letting point of view, that's an awful lot of units to let in one location, no matter where you are. So something around the 250 unit mark for us is kind of a sweet spot. It's large enough that you get the efficiencies to have on-site amenities, but not too large that it's too many units to let. The interesting thing that we're increasingly looking at, though, is whether under our build-to-rent fund, we'd take out a slice of the say that overall number for a rental, and then another segment under a different sub-fund of shared ownership that could work in parallel. So we could approach or engage with a developer to potentially take a larger part of the overall site. But as Jonathan said, 1,000 is probably too many, especially if it was all single-family housing rather than flatted development.
But the key thing is that to keep when you're managing resi, the key thing is to kind of keep your management costs down to a minimal levels, because otherwise you just erode the yield to levels that just aren't going to be palatable for anybody, institutions or anyone. So ultimately, it's about the build quality as well that needs to come through in that sector. It's not just a question of taking standard private sale, whether it's Barratt's, Bellway, standard housing. You do need to. If you're going to own as a long term and put a rental product together, it's about driving down those management costs, and that does mean that you often have to invest more upfront into the quality of the finishes, because otherwise you spend your whole time redecorating, redoing floors on each relet, and it becomes very costly. So again, I think it will be, to answer the question, it will be smaller schemes that are built to higher standards that are actually specifically designed for the rental market, rather than just conversion of private sale developments.
But I guess the attraction there is if you own a portfolio of houses, you don't have lifts and service charges. It's effectively the rent is triple net, right? And ultimately, I guess, even for a very large institution, you'd need to think about your exit. Hopefully, it might be in 20, 30 years' time, but having the option of selling individual homes can also be quite attractive in the longer term.
Yeah, indeed, that's very much, Nick, been our business case for investing in schemes like the one in Crawley, that you could sell them individually as one route of exit, or the primary expectation is to still sell it to an institution if we do decide to exit. But it's that benefit of no lifts, 2 to 3 stories with communal facilities, so it's big enough that you can justify putting in a clubhouse, putting in a Muga, a tennis court, to create the sense of place for the residents where they want to stay longer, and that then drives lower voids, better customer satisfaction, but isn't small enough that it then starts to erode the gross to net. If it's too small, then we can have problems on that regard.
Yeah. I had another question. This is quite interesting. The investment community is quite vocal and engaged with the ESG agenda. Do the panel find that developers and operators are on the same page, or do you need to insist on higher standards to meet your ESG criteria? Anybody can take that. Okay, Freddie.
So increasingly for us, ESG is of vital importance, and is important to incorporate it throughout all of our decision-making process. In terms of that question of whether we need to prompt developers to increase their ESG credentials, to date, yes, that very much has been the case, that we're pushing to have more green initiatives or green features within the environmental considerations for the building, or indeed specific accreditation, whether it's Home Quality Mark, BREEAM, LEED or WELL or other accreditation, that it's normally us as the investor pushing for that. But interestingly, with some of our investor partners, like for instance, Watkin Jones, it's a key part of their future strategy of the business to increase the sustainable initiatives they're developing too. to meet their client, i.e. the investor needs, and indeed the end consumer. So increasingly we are finding that developers are coming to us having thought about the kind of things that we would want to see in buildings with regard to sustainability. But it's only just starting to happen.
Mm.
I think I can also comment from a REIT's perspective, given we've got some, substantial shareholders who, similarly, I guess, to what Freddie described, are incredibly interested in sort of understanding the company's credentials in this field. And I think when it comes to operating assets, one of the words that I'm increasingly hearing is how do we offset or mitigate our carbon? There's a lot of talk about net zero buildings or targeting a reduction in consumption around utilities. And ultimately it's all coming from the same place, right? I think it's the investor, but it's the stakeholder in the asset. So for us, we're housing 4,000 students. An 18-year-old nowadays cares a lot about, where do we source our energy and how do we manage our buildings? So it's a very important agenda, I think, for the industry, and clearly one that's not going to go anywhere. It's one for us to all embrace and find ways of actually, changing our footprint, our impact on the environment and society.
Thanks, Nick. We're about to wrap up, but I just wanted to ask, maybe other than COVID, because of course we've all been through these very, very challenging times and hopefully onto recovery, what else could maybe knock the recovery off track? What goes through your minds other than COVID? It could be geopolitical tensions or anything like that. Would anyone like to take that? Okay, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll shoot. I mean, I do think risks post-COVID kind of skew to the downside. I think government debt could have probably will have a drag on growth as we come out of this going forward. GDP forecasts were already, more anemic or less positive kind of post-Brexit than they would have otherwise been had we remained. We still don't have a settlement for financial services post-Brexit, which I think, should be a concern, particularly in the Southeast. So, and there's a lot of stimulus, which will have, certainly has, the risk of kind of inflationary, there's inflationary risk with all the kind of the government stimulus programs, both in the States here and in the UK. So I think there's a stagflation risk where you've got a stagnant economy and kind of price inflation. And obviously that's a challenging environment, particularly if there's kind of capital outflows and Bank of England has to raise rates to defend currency. So I don't think it's plain sailing. I mean, I think it's within the residential sector, and obviously I'm kind of staying within my lane at the moment. We're pleased that we're not doing, we're in an area where there is demand and kind of fundamentally there is population growth and supply demand imbalance. So, there's a rationale for our product, but I think there's kind of macro factors that could potentially derail residential just as a whole asset class.
Thanks, Jonathan. Anybody else like to chip in?
Well, I was thinking of the stimulus in a similar way to Jonathan that we're seeing, which is unprecedented, clearly as a result of COVID, and what that might do in terms of skewing capital markets, which could surprise us on an upside in terms of demand for assets and yield compression, but it can also have as Jonathan pointed out, an undesirable effect in terms of eroding the value of money. Through inflation. I guess from my perspective, the thing I worry a little bit about, although I'm a little bit less worried now, is the geopolitical risk around China and a fallout with China, particularly for our portfolio where we've got quite a reliance on students from Southeast Asia. But it feels like that's kind of reduced. Now Trump's not in power and Biden seems to be making some of the right noises, but clearly over a sort of 5 to 10 year time horizon, we'll have to sort of wait and see how that changes.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. We're out of time. However, I'd encourage people, if they wanted to carry on networking, just to use the chat function afterwards. But really enjoyed the conversation. Our next, just as a reminder, the webinar tomorrow, Battle of the Asset Classes, who will be the winners post-crisis, takes place at 10 o'clock GMT tomorrow. And I see Honor Barrett's on there, Birch Grove, on very innovative retirement product. Big thank you. See you tomorrow. Oh, sorry, I forgot this one. Yeah, just as an aside, if people want to join the rest of the webinars from maybe Tuesday onwards now, there are the topics. Thank you everybody for joining us, but particularly Jonathan, Patrick, Freddie and Nick. If people are interested in sponsoring the Urban Living Festival, do speak to my colleague Katie Houghton. Her contact details are on your screen there. And again, thank you for attending, and to Yardi for sponsoring the series. Take care.
Thanks, Piers.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.